morning, church. It's glad to finally be back here with you guys today. I'm sure you all know a lot of what's happened to my family the last few days. It's been interesting. I'll share with you guys the story because there's a couple of different versions going around. But it's funny, I was talking to my wife yesterday, and it seems like the last 2 years that we've been here, inevitably, one of the months that we are talking about, one of the themes, will directly relate to something that we are going through in our own lives. Last year in February, we talked about prevailing through suffering and the story of Job. And that's when I shared with you guys the story of how my wife and I went through this miscarriage a few days before. And we shared that with you. And now we're talking about prevailing through the wilderness. And I'm going to share with you guys kind of what's been happening in our home. And so I was quipping to my wife. I said, you know what, baby, I think I need to talk with Pastor Lafitte and maybe rearrange the schedule next year so that the whole year is on the prosperity gospel. So that something good can come out of this. You know, prosperity gospel, that'd be even better. But this is what happened. So 2 Wednesdays ago, I'm coming back from Kendall. We were having an activity with my son. And I had just spoken to my wife a few minutes ago, and I said, "How are you doing, sweetie?" She said, "I'm doing well." So I said, I'll be home in about 20 minutes. And so I'm driving down the turnpike. When lo and behold, about 5 minutes later, I get a phone call from my wife. I'm like, "Oh, it's interesting." I just picked up and I hear my daughter screaming, and like screaming, not regular screaming. And my wife sounds a little bit off, and she says, "When are you going to be home?" "I'm about 15 minutes away." Click. And I'm like, okay, this is different. This isn't normal. So I try calling her up, and she doesn't pick up. And I try calling her again, and she doesn't pick up. And so I call about 15 times on the turnpike because I really feel something is off. And so she finally picks up, and she's sobbing, she's crying, and she said, "When are you going to be here?" I'm like, "I'm about 10 minutes away. What's going on?" And she says, "Nothing. Call my aunt." Her aunt is an EMT, a nurse in the emergency room, and my daughter's still screaming in the background. I say, "Hey, what's happening?" Call 911. She said, "They're already here." Click. So, again, this is the only information I have. I'm expecting the absolute worst. I don't know what happened, and so I do as I'm told. I call her aunt and I say, "Hey, Myra, listen, Sarah, I don't know what's going on, but I need you to go to our house." And she's like, I'm on my way, but I'll be there as soon as I can. What's going on?" She's like, "I don't know. Sarah's crying, the baby's crying. Apparently the paramedics, the EMT is there. I have no idea what's going on. Please get over there." And she's like, "Okay, I'm on my way. I'll be there in a few minutes." And so again, you can imagine what's going through my mind. I don't know what's going on. I'm on the highway going home, and I'm like, something really bad is going on. My wife apparently hasn't told me what's happening. But my son is in the back, and I'm like, okay, this is not a drill. This is not a drill. So I get to the house, and sure enough, I see all the police, the EMTs, the fire department, they're all there. And so I leave my son outside the car, and so I go inside, not knowing what to expect. And so I go inside, and I see my wife on the couch, and she has scalds all over her legs. And I said, what happened? She said, she's in between the sobbing, the crying, she says, "I spilled pot of beans all over my legs." And I said, oh, okay. And sure enough, I walked to the kitchen, and the whole kitchen full of beans everywhere. And so the paramedics, they say, "We're going to have to take her to the hospital." And I'm like, "Where are you guys taking her?" And they're taking her to West Kendall. And so I said, okay. And she said, "Take care of the kids. I can take care of the kids." And I said, "Sweetheart, don't worry. I got the kids. No problem." And she's like, "You're going to give them some food?" And I said, "Sweetheart, don't worry about it." And she said, "That's a mom." I said, "Listen, don't worry about it." And she's like, "What are you going to give them?" I said, "Well, there's a lot of beans here." And then the paramedics were like, "Oh." And I'm like, I'm sorry. I get nervous. I make terrible jokes. I'm sorry. And so that really happened, by the way. That really did happen. And so I said, "No, sweetheart, don't worry. I'll take care of it. It's good." And so I brought Isaac in. And Isaac, you know, he's been a trooper. He's been a champ. He's really great. He goes, "Bye, mommy. Have fun. Bye, mommy." And so my wife is just kind of like, you know, she's crying. She's going through this. My wife's aunt gets here just as the paramedics are leaving, and so she sees this. And so I said, "Thank you. If you could just go with her, I'll take care of the kids." And so I called Ellen, She's one of the first people that came over. And Ellen, thank you so much. She came with my mom that same night and helped me put the kids to bed, and we kind of figured this out. And so my wife is in West Kendall Regional, and so the prognosis, she had second, possibly third-degree burns on her legs. And it wasn't like a sunburn. This was just like, to save you the graphic details, it was a serious burn. The next day they did surgery on her. They wrapped her legs up in bandages, and so they said, you have to be in this for the foreseeable future. And so it was hard, really hard in our home for a few days. And thankfully, I want to thank you especially, not just as a pastor, but as a husband and a father, for the way this church has come together and helped us out during this really trying time. People came, a bunch of text messages and emails and phone calls. If I never got back to you, it's because I had a ton of them coming in. Thank you so much for everyone that's been praying for us. Meal trains, wonderful. People coming over to help out. Thank you so much for that. The hardest part was my daughter, because you see, my wife had been used to putting her down for sleep, and she didn't take a bottle for the first few nights. And so it was hard basically being in a zombie mode the first few days. She's not taking a bottle, crying through the night. My wife feels terrible because she's back at home after surgery. And it was really, really hard. But lo and behold, we wait a week until we go back to the doctor's office. And the whole week, my wife had just been in excruciating pain, just taking the pain medication, tramadol. She wasn't really feeling like herself. And so we go back to the doctor's office the next week, and they're trying to change the bandages, and she's not able to get through it. It's too much pain. So they tell her, we're going to have to do a second surgery. And she asks, well, what's the prognosis look like? When can I feel like myself again? They say that to feel like yourself is going to take up to a year. To be back on your feet, it's going to be about 2 months. And that wasn't the news that we were expecting. It was not the news we were expecting, but we understood, based on how she felt, that was what was going on. So that was not news we were expecting. When I talk about going through, if you can get that on the screen, launching into the wilderness, that's the slide, that's the theme of today. We know a thing or two in our home about what it feels like to go through a wilderness experience. We're going through it right now. And so I'm not going to be giving you theory. I'm giving you what we have gone through and what we are clinging to as we are going through this wilderness journey in the Fernández household. But if there's anything that you take away from today's message, I'll be sharing with you guys a story about the children of Israel and how they got bad news. But if there's nothing else that you remember in your journey from what I'm going to be sharing today, understand this, is that if we know that God allows us into the wilderness, trust that He will also lead us out of it. If there's anything else that this is what I want you guys to remember. God allows certain things in your lives, but if you're there, understand and trust that the way that you're going to get through this is only through His might and through His power. Okay? So, we join today's story. We're going to go to the Israelites. We've already talked about what happened to the children of Israel after they went through the Red Sea. So they had passed the Red Sea. They'd gone through all that stuff. They already saw God's presence on Mount Sinai. They saw His glory. They saw God come down, deliver the Ten Commandments. They saw all of that. Now we find the children of Israel having gotten to the very borders of the Promised Land. They send out 12 spies to survey the land. After some days, these spies come back. They see the report and they share with the congregation a lot of news. They say, there's really, really good news. There's huge pieces of grapes. These are some grapes from Palestine. Some of the best batches. They said, there's so many grapes that it takes people carrying them with two people to carry them. And sure enough, this is kind of what they came back with. There's a lot of grapes. It's amazing, but there's a catch to this whole situation. Yes, it's flowing with milk and honey. There's a lot of good things that we have there, but the problem is that there are these giants there. There's these huge individuals there. They're all over the place. They're big. 10 of the spies out of the 12 came back with a bad report. They said, yes, there's a lot of good things going on, but they gave the children of Israel bad news. They gave them news that they weren't expecting. And they said, based on this situation, our prognosis, our chances of success are minimal. Because here's the thing, they said in Numbers 13, but the people who live there are really powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. So they got some really bad news that day. And the congregation, they were like, what are we going to do with this information? This is not what we were expecting. This is not what we were expecting. In the midst of that, there's a lot of turmoil. There's a lot of discussion. And they're like, should we do this? Should we not do this? What are we going to do? And that leads us to the scripture reading of this morning that was read, where they said, oh, if only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. Why is it that the Lord is bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and our children will be as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to each other, we should choose a leader and go back to Egypt. So again, they had already gone through the Red Sea experience. They had already seen God's power delivering them from the children of Israel, from Egypt. They had seen all of that. But they get to the borders of the promised land, they get bad news, and their reaction is to throw in the towel. Most of the people that came back from serving the land came back with the same idea, that this is too much for us, with the exception of two individuals, Joshua and Caleb, two youngest individuals in this group of 10 spies. They came back and they heard this situation, they heard this commotion, they heard that the children of Israel were saying, no, we can't do this. And they did the only thing that, biblically speaking, they could do to show their feelings. They pulled a Superman. They ripped open their shirts. But unlike Superman, this didn't mean that they were ripping their shirts in order to launch back into battle and single-handedly free the children of Israel from the Canaanites. This was not the case, because you see, in that culture, ripping your shirt, rending your clothes was a sign of anguish. It was a sign of just extreme despondency, despair, like, what is going on? They did this in the sight of all Israel, and they said, children of Israel, please, 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 don't give up on God. They had this report. They said that the land which we passed through in search is an exceedingly good land. And if the Lord delights in us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which floweth with milk and honey. In verse 9, only rebel not ye against the Lord. Please don't rebel. Neither fear ye the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their defense is departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Fear them not. They said, guys, look at what we've been through. God has already been so good to us. He has saved us from Egypt. He's brought us to this wilderness. And right now, these people are defenseless because we're going and we're facing this challenge in the power of Almighty God. There's nothing we have to fear from them. Please just don't turn your backs on what we've already known or what we've seen. Trust God in this situation. We can do this. But did they listen to the two? No. They talked pretty game. But at the end of the day, the 10 prevailed. 10 out of 12. The majority won the day. Now, this is something for us to consider as we're going through this study today. This is one of those minor points that is in the middle. It's that people of fear and people of faith experience the same thing. Yeah. Most of the times, it doesn't matter if you're a believer or non-believer, whatever. Many times we live the very same experiences, but there's a difference in the way we process them. But this is something to consider, is don't take the presence of the storm to indicate the absence of God. Just because you feel something's going on in your life right now the way you didn't expect, getting news you didn't expect, something occurring that you didn't expect, don't mean that God has withdrawn his presence from your life. It doesn't mean that. But there's something that you have to consider as you're going through this situation, because consider this, that Joshua and Caleb saw opportunity and the other 10 spies saw defeat. Why? Why did 10 out of the 12 come back with a negative report of the land and only 2 came back with a positive report? Had to do with simply the matter of perspective. Perspective. See, again, Joshua and Caleb were individuals that came from a faith-based perspective. And this teaches us something, that we can choose in our lives to live lives of fear or choose to live a life of faith. Those are 2 ways that we can choose to live our lives. And either one, in this very moment, we are either living currently a life of faith or a life of fear. And it's moments when we have difficulties that these things show up. Notice what this quote says. One of the things that kind of keeps us from experiencing or maybe processing this in a good way is the way we perceive the situation and the way we perceive ourselves. Numbers 13:33, they said, we perceive ourselves as grasshoppers to them. But when we compare ourselves to the circumstances we were sent to change, we've taken the wrong perspective. When we got the news that this was going to take us at least, a year to recover, this was not the news we were expecting, obviously. And one thing that this has personally taught me, this experience that we're going through in our house, is that, and I got this as a quote, is that crisis doesn't create character, it reveals it. So if we think that when we get to a situation that we're like, this is how I'm going to grow, it's not always the case, because many times who you really are, how God has grown you when you're in these times of challenges, that's what comes out. Not what you hope you would be like. But who you really are tends to come out in these moments of crises. But at the same time, as we said in our Facebook this week, you never realize how strong you are until being strong is the only choice you have. When your back is against the wall, when there's no plan B, when you just have to get through it, this is where true strength is found. And this brings us back to the point that I want you to remember this morning, is that if we know God allows us into the wilderness, trust that He will also lead us out of it. We find ourselves there. So the children of Israel, they were despondent, they were complaining, they said, this is enough. They were backbiting, they did all these negative things, and it got to God. God heard this situation, and He said the following. He said, listen, God brings Moses to the tabernacle, and God, in the presence of all these Israelites, He tells Moses, how long will these people reject me? And how long will they not believe me with all the signs which I have performed among them? Now, if there's anyone that has the right to feel frustrated in this situation, it's probably God. In Egypt, how many things did He do? A lot of signs, a lot of wonders, and again and again, He's showing them these things. And He says in one of the, I think it's funny, but then again, like I said, in these crisis situations, I have a really weird sense of humor. I make jokes about beans and whatnot. But God says this to Moses as He's talking about it. He says, Moses, listen, come here. I have an idea. How about I smite them with a pestilence? And I'll disinherit them, and I'm going to make you a greater nation and mightier than they. Moses, how about in front of everybody, I wipe these people out with a plague, then I'll start again with you, and then we're going to start this whole thing all over again. You know what Moses does? Moses says, God, you need a Snickers. Because this isn't like you. Moses intercedes for the people. He reminds God of His character. He reminds God of His goodness. And this shows us a lot about the growth of Moses. Because remember, he found himself in the wilderness before. Himself. 40 years ago, he had killed somebody in a fit of righteous indignation, killed the Egyptian, ran through the wilderness to Midian, and now God calls him out as an 80-year-old man back to liberate these children of Israel. And they find themselves back in the wilderness, and God reminds God Himself of His own character. He says, listen, Lord, if everyone hears that you smote these people because of your anger, what are they going to say about you? What are this new congregation going to think about you? And he continues, he says, listen, for you said, God, you said, quoting His word back to Him, Yahweh, God is slow to anger and filled with unfailing love, forgiving every kind of sin and rebellion, but He does not excuse the guilty. He lays the sins of the parent upon, but lays the sins of the parent upon their children. The entire family is affected, even children in the third and fourth generation. In keeping with your magnificent, unfailing love, please pardon the sins of these people, just as you have forgiven them ever since they left Egypt. He reminds God of His goodness. And in these moments when we go through challenge, we go through turmoil, how many times are we remembering to intercede for our family back to God? God, you have said this. You have told us this. Remember who you are, Father. Remember your unfailing love. And because he went through this, you know what God does? God was like, you know, Moses, you're right. The Lord replied, I have forgiven them as you have asked. God forgave the children of Israel. You know, we got home from our appointment last Wednesday, right before the second surgery. And obviously this was not the news we were expecting. My mother-in-law came the day right after the accident, after the surgery, Wednesday before. And we were expecting her to come near the end of the month for my daughter's first birthday. But she came the next day, obviously like a mom. She put everything aside, put aside her fear of flying, and came from Boston down here to help us out. Wonderful, wonderful news that we got. But she was not expecting this news of 2 months. You know, she's been helping us for a month, but in her mind, she thought, I'm not going to be able to take care of my daughter. And I'm going to be all the way up in Boston, and she's going to be here going through this. And so obviously, imagine as a mother how you must feel. My wife thinking, you know, when am I going to be able to put my kids to bed at night regularly? When am I going to feel like myself again? And thinking it's going to take up to a year for me to feel the same way. Like I can't even hold my daughter. And when we got home, there was just this air of just defeat that we were dealing with at home. And my wife was on the couch, and the kids were asleep. My mother-in-law, I saw her. She was by the window, and my mom was there. She was taking care of the kids as we were at the doctor's. And there was just a really, really somber mood in the air. And I realized that at this point, I had to be a pastor to my family. And I said, hey, you know, let's come together here in the living room. And I said, guys, you know, this is not the news that we were expecting. Obviously, we didn't expect this. But, you know, remember, we have been talking about this at church. And I talked about this leading through the desert, but here we're in our wilderness experience. We're in it right now. And I want to remember, guys, that we'd been through this. By this time, my daughter was taking a bottle. And so we praise God for that. And my son actually, in this little thing, he actually started potty training and did a great job. He did a great job. So I was praising God for that. So remember, we need to look for the little beauties, the little silver linings in these moments. Because now I'm able to put Charlotte down to bed, and I'm able to form a bond with my daughter in ways that I hadn't done before, because I hadn't been able to put her down. Isaac is doing the potty. So in this situation, yes, it stinks. I would rather have not found ourselves here. But we can choose to either deal with this from a time of like despondence and despair, or try to find the beauty in all these things. And so I don't know the future of what's going to happen, but we need to pray together that God, if nothing else, for our kids, because they're seeing us go through this, and the way that we respond to this, they're going to look at this and they're going to repeat this whenever they go through challenges. And so we need to remember that. And so right there, we got together, we prayed as a family. We reminded God of his goodness. We reminded who God was. So God, you have told us this, you've told us this. And so we don't know why we're here, but we're trusting you with this matter. We're asking you, Lord, to be with us as we're going through this challenge. Help this surgery tomorrow to go great. Help us to get better news. And we don't know what's going to happen, but we want you, God, to be a part of this. So we did that, and that's it. We kind of left it in God's hands. The children of Israel, when they went through challenges, Moses interceded on his people's behalf. And when we go through challenges, we must intercede on our behalf and on the behalf of others that are going through challenges. Now, God did that. But the children of Israel still had no frame of reference, because only Moses was interceding for them. They really didn't care about being interceded for. So God had probably one of the strongest statements of anything he has to say to this group of people. He said, Moses, I've forgiven them because you asked me to forgive them. But, verse 20, I've pardoned according to your word, but truly as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, because all these men who have seen my glory and the signs which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have put me to the test now these 10 times, and have not heeded my voice, they certainly shall not see the land of which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who rejected me see it. Now, this is interesting to me, because I was like, hold up. God seemed to remember, like an elephant never forgets. God kept tabs of these 10 times that these children had gone crazy. And I was like, hold up. doesn't the Bible say that God forgives all sins that we confess? Yeah. This must mean that in these 10 times, nobody asked forgiveness for those sins. Because they're still there and God remembers them. And so I was like, hold on, what are these 10 times that had happened and God remembers them? And I was like, okay, there are 10 times. Exodus 14, the Red Sea, they leave Egypt after all these signs and they're like, oh, Pharaoh's here, we're going to die. He's going to destroy us. 1. After they cross the Red Sea, they go to Marah and God already opens the Red Sea and they go drink some water and they say, ooh, this water tastes like the water in Orlando. It's so sour. And God's like, okay. And so they call it Marah because it's so bitter. And so God's like, listen, so the water doesn't taste like Miami tap water. Okay, the agua 305 es muy buena. Okay, I get it. But strike 2. 3, when they get to the desert of sin. Oh, we're so hungry. God let us out here to die of hunger. Okay, strike 3. 4, desert of sin again. Moses tells the children of Israel after God provides manna. Moses says, guys, look, you can't store manna overnight because it comes every day. God's going to give to you every day. And so I said, Moisés no sabe nada. He doesn't know anything. So they keep some manna. And the next day it goes rotten. And God goes, okay, I told you. Okay, strike 4. Strike 5. God says, guys, look, no manna comes on Sabbath. So don't go out on Sabbath. They go out on Sabbath because they don't trust God. Okay, 5. 6. They go to Rephidim. Oh, we have no water. We're going to die. 7, Mount Sinai, the whole golden calf incident. Maybe Moses is dead. Let's make this big cow and dance around it. 8, Taberah. We're in a desert. This is the worst place to be in. This is such a terrible situation. God gets really upset. He does some crazy things there, but we'll move on. In Numbers 11, in Kibroth Hatava. Oh, we miss meat. They had the best asada in Egypt. And God goes, okay, I'll give you guys quail. I'll give you quail until you don't want any quail anymore. And so he gives them quail. And then in 10, they're in Kadesh, where they are in the desert of Paran. We can't take Canaan. We can't do it. We saw the children of Anak. They're so big. They're too numerous for us. So again, these 10 times which reveal a pattern of lack of trust to God are the reason why the children of Israel didn't go into Egypt. Or didn't go into Canaan. Because it's not in the single instance that you say, okay, I'm going to trust God with this, and you fail. It's in a continuous pattern. Once we over and over and over and over and over again trust God, don't recognize where we're wrong, refuse to take responsibility for the things we ought to, and just move on as if nothing ever happened, that God sees these patterns of behavior, and he sees that, and he saw that the children of Israel, how could God entrust the future of the kingdom to individuals who had consistently never trusted him to begin with? Crisis reveals our character and often teaches us more about ourselves than we might learn in times of peace. And in these crisis situations, the children of Israel showed over and over again that they had not learned a thing. Their hearts remained the same. So if you're in a situation and you're like, man, why am I still in this situation? This is terrible. I should not be in it. Well, understand, sometimes God doesn't change your situation because he's trying to change your heart. Because he's trying to get your attention, and for some reason you think it's about something else. But God is ultimately trying to change our hearts into people, men and women, who love God and love people. He's trying to mold our hearts and to be more like his likeness. So rather than running from pain, rather than running from conflict, we must embrace and lean into it. As I've been saying again, if we know that God allows us into the wilderness, trust that he will also lead us out of it. So God goes on again, and he doesn't say, okay, you guys are going to die in the wilderness. He says it many times. He says, okay, listen. God goes on. This is just an interesting situation. God says, listen, the carcasses of you who have complained against me shall fall in the wilderness. All of you who were numbered according to your entire number from 20 years old and above. Anybody 20 years old and above, except for Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun. You shall by no means enter the land which I swore I would make you dwell in. But your little ones, whom you said would be victims, I will bring in. and they shall know the land which you have despised. You know, it's interesting that God says, everyone that's over 20, cutoff point, you guys aren't going to go in, except for Joshua and Caleb. You guys are cool. This reveals to me, I think, something that's important for us to understand, is that sometimes the older we get, the more cynical, the less trusting we are in God. And at this point, they were saying, God had to say, that it's only the children who haven't been tainted by this spirit of, oh, we can't do this, the spirit of just lack of cooperation. Those were the ones that were going to inherit the promised land. I sometimes wonder if that's the same thing today. I sometimes wonder, as the challenges we face as a church, the challenges we face as a world, and there was just a study released in Barna like last week, we picked it up, that reveals that these Generation Zs and that's what they're calling Generation Z, those kids that don't know a world before 9/11. They don't know this. They don't believe in religion. They're very cynical. Their whole world, their entire upbringing, think about this. Their entire upbringing has been in the context of the war on terror. It's always something. It's always shootings in schools and stabbings. This is their frame of reference. Everything is checkpoints at the airport. They don't know a world of peace. They've become cynical with religion, cynical with everything. But you know what's interesting? They're connected more than any generation in history, but at the same time, they're struggling with isolation. Irony. But they also are very deeply connected about matters of spirituality. They know that God is out there, but they just don't know where he's at. They don't know how to find him. And I think about, this is a situation that's primed to be molded by the power of God. Instead of arguing about issues that our church sometimes seems to be entrenched in. What if God said the same thing to us? You guys have been arguing over women's ordination for the last 10 years, 5 years, so nobody over 20 is going to live to see the second coming. Because we refuse to get it together. We refuse to talk with one another, and we refuse to be changed by the power of God. Instead, we complain and we conspire behind pastors' back, and we complain about administration, and we do this either. Instead of thinking and trusting that God, in his plans and his promises, he operates in a way that's beyond any sort of reasoning and planning. Sometimes we just have to leave things to God in faith and say, I don't know how the sea is going to open up, but I'm trusting that there's a God that opens seas, and he's going to do something great. But the children of Israel had been so caught up in trusting their plans. We made 5-year and 10-year and 15-year goals that there was no room for God to operate in this. How could God operate when we had figured things out by ourselves? So what if God said the same thing to us? Because we have conspired and refused consistently to trust God, you guys aren't going to see the second coming that you talk so much about. I'm going to leave it to your children. Because they're connected more than ever before. And you know what? This is true. They don't see that there's real leaders in the world anymore. Who are the leaders that we're looking up to today? Who are they? God said there was nobody in there. And so he said nobody over 20 is going to be allowed to see this. This is biblical precedent. And don't give me that, oh, well, listen, this was a majority vote. The majority decided to not go into the promised land. I don't care if everybody prays and said, God, lead this vote. The vote, if it goes, okay, I don't want, this is not what I'm trying to say. Okay. I know I made the point about women's ordination, but that's not the point I was trying to make in this one. But the reality is, just because a group of people get together and pray for God's will doesn't mean it's God's will. 10 out of the 12 people prayed, said, you know what, this isn't doable. We can't see with our eyes that we're going to take this. There's no way we're going to do this. The majority wasn't right in this one. Anytime that we try to live a life that's based on our own plans, our own view, rather than what God has established in his word, trusting that God somehow, some way, even though we don't have the answer to this, is going to lead in this, we're relying on our own power and our own strategies, and that's going to lead us back into the wilderness. And that's what happened with the children of Israel. God said, your children will be shepherds here for 40 years, suffering for your unfaithfulness until the last of your bodies lies in the desert. So he said it. I, the Lord, have spoken. Thus I will do to all the wicked band that has banded together against me. In this very wilderness they shall die to the last man. So they wept and they cried. And they imagine if God had said the same thing to us, they were defeated. They didn't know what to do. But you know one of the interesting things about this story is that they pray about it, and the next day, they try to conquer the land again. They pray about it. They have this really hard night. They're like, oh, this is terrible. And the next day, it says the next day, Moses reported Yahweh's word to the Israelites. The people were filled with grief. And they got up early the next morning and went up to the top of the range of the hills and said, all right, let's go. They said, we realize that we've sinned, but now we're ready to enter the land Yahweh has promised us. They're like, okay, listen, we know we messed up. RB, my bad, Lord. We recognize this was our mistake. We're going to take it anyways, all right? Right? We're going to do this, right? Yeah, we're going to do this. We're going to do it. And Moses is like, dude, don't do this. Don't do this. Moses said, why are you disobeying the Lord's command? This will not succeed. But don't go up because the Lord is not with you. You'll be defeated by your enemies. And they're like, no, we're good. We have a good number. We have good strategy. We're going to do it. And so they fought, and they got beat up. And a bunch of people died. And Moses was like, I told you guys. And because of this, they literally launched once again into the wilderness. 40 years of wandering in the deserts because they refused to remember the very simple fact that when we don't trust God, when we don't trust God that God will fight the battles for us, we will often seek to more tightly control other aspects of our lives. They said, well, we can't control obviously going, God forgiving us, but maybe we can try to take this by force. This happens to us sometimes where we think that God shouldn't be answering this, and we don't find that God is answering one angle of our spirituality, so we try to control other aspects of our lives. And I'll give you one example. I got a phone call on Tuesday from a gentleman, which I don't know, I didn't get his name. He called my number thinking I was still the pastor of the church that I used to pastor in South Carolina, and I tried to point him to the direction of the pastor that was there right now. He said, no, actually, I'd rather not talk to them. I want to talk to you if that's okay, because I just need a consult. I haven't been to church in like years and years, but I was born a Seventh-day Adventist. I don't go to church, but my parents taught me about the Sabbath, and I want to basically say that I don't want to work on Sabbath because that's the day that I consider holy. But I don't go to a church. I just do my own thing. And I said, well, see, the challenging thing here is that we provide Sabbath accommodation forms as a church to anyone that says, hey, I want to dedicate my Sabbath hours to, and this is what we write in the letter, to communing with the Lord and with the church. I do service. I do all these things on Sabbath that if I work, it would not allow me to do what I want to do for God in my community. But you don't have a community, and I don't know how your walk with God is because I'm not your pastor. So you're really just asking for an exemption based on the fact that your parents were Adventists when you're little. Do you have a community, anyone that you attend? He's like, no, because I don't believe in religion. So basically, he just wanted the Sabbath off. And I was like, I can't advise against it, because if they do a little bit of digging, they're going to find out that you don't attend anywhere, and you're going to get yourself in a lot of trouble, because essentially you're saying that I do these things and you don't do them. I mean, more than anything, God doesn't want you. I'd rather you stay at home and connect with God than lie about something. But you need to connect to a community. And so he just didn't have it. And it's interesting, as I said, you can't do this. You shouldn't do this. He started talking about, well, I'm a good person, and I give back my taxes, and I honor the police, and I do this, that, and the other. And I'm like, well, that's great. It has nothing to do with the Sabbath accommodation form. But the reality is that God isn't judging you on those things. Even the Sabbath, if you keep the Sabbath without having a relationship with God, you're missing the point of the Sabbath. But he still insisted on having the Sabbath off. And I was like, but why? Why do you want the Sabbath off? And it's easy for us to think, oh, this is just someone that didn't know the thing. But the reality is that the children of Israel, they knew everything that God had told them, and yet they still didn't trust God. So we can sometimes do the same thing, knowing everything that we do. Sometimes we'll say, well, I've done all these things, God. I come to church, I tithe, I read my lesson, I do all these things, I do all these wonderful things for you. And yet somehow, for some reason, I have this situation. And we do like the children of Israel. We throw it back to God. And we say, God, why did you allow this to happen? Why is this? Why that? And we really point to our own our own track record. We point to our own degree. We point to our resume and say, God, based on this resume that I've accumulated, I should be exempt. But if Jesus wasn't exempt from suffering or from pain, what makes us think that we will be? What makes us think that in the suffering, this world that we live in, this chaos, again, we mentioned that people of faith and people of fear, we all experience the same thing. Why should we be exempt from even having to participate in this? There's nothing that will exempt us from it. Instead, we can choose to be warriors that pray. One thing that was fascinating to me is that right after this report that we got about having to have now a second surgery, and this report of taking up to a year to heal. My wife had been walking with a cane, and my Christine helped us out with a cane. Thank you so much. And Micheline and George, they helped us out with a little walker. You know, my wife walking around with a walker, and that. I know we had such an interesting situation, thinking, how long is this going to go? That same day when we got that prognosis, and we said, you know, we need to put this in prayer to the Lord. Carl Kennedy, somewhere in here. I don't know if you're here, Carl. Oh, there you are, Carl. Carl, you don't know this. I haven't told you this. But Lafitte told me that night that sometime around the 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock hour, he gets a phone call, if he gets a phone call. And he says, Carl says, Pastor, I don't know why. I hope I'm not stepping on any toes, but I feel that we need to put the plans this evening aside. Usually after our prayer meetings, we split up into 4. We pray for like community and family and nation and sicknesses. And he says, listen, I don't know why, but I feel like we just need to intercede for the pastor and his family. I just feel like we really need to do that. He had no clue that we had just been given this really terrible news. And in our house, we had this real feeling of defeat. He didn't know this. You didn't know this. So that night, they got together and they interceded. They lifted our family up in prayer. They didn't know this until after the fact. And we said, the whole church has lifted you up in prayer. And we were like, wow, thank you for that. We go into surgery the next day, knowing that we were prayed for. And let me tell you, the difference between the first week and the second week was night and day. We had the surgery on Thursday. My wife stopped using her tramadol, the heavy pain medication, on Sunday night. She didn't need it anymore. Yesterday, she stopped using her cane and her wheelchair and the walker. She's hobbling around a little bit. Yeah. We've seen God's power. We went to that, like I said, the first time we went, before they told us we had to have a second surgery, they took out the bandages. She had to have the skin graft. She couldn't do it the first time. After the second surgery, it took some challenge. They had put her in a little pool, a little jacuzzi, and I tried to keep my mouth shut from making any inappropriate jokes. It took some pain. It took some challenge, but she kept on saying over and over again, this is only temporary. This is only temporary. I gave birth to 2 children. I can do this. And so I was like, yeah, you can do this, girl. You can do this. So they took it off, and so now she just has compressions on her legs, and she's walking. She's going through this. And who knows? It might not take a year. In this situation, I want to thank the church, one, for praying, because your prayers really helped us out in this. But notice what happened. We have a family member who we told this has happened to. He's not an active church member, but he said, wow, it looks like prayer actually works. When you're going through your journey, your wilderness journey, understand that you're also being watched. You don't know who's watching you, your children, your family members, those around you. As you go through your challenges, understand that people are watching you. And the reality is we can choose to be one of 2 things. People matter to God, and we want God to matter to people. So we can choose to be bridges to help them get from where they are to where God wants them to be. We can choose to be bridges, or we can choose to be barriers. By the way that we respond and by the way we act and react to situations and circumstances, God can either be glorified and we can point people to Him, or we can point people back into the wilderness. So we need to be very mindful of how we respond to challenges, but trust that, as we said from the beginning, if we know that God allows us into the wilderness, we must trust that He will also lead us out of it. So, what's your decision today? We have a QR code that you can scan. As we do, very simple decision to make. You can choose to be a person of faith or a person of fear. And as you scan your phone, we have a few different options. One, if you're interested in getting involved in some way, shape, or form, you say, you know what, I'm tired of being, I think the phrase you used, I think Pastor Lafitte, was a passenger. I want to become a crew member. I want to become involved. Choose that first option. If you're interested in joining a small group, because realize that we must work in community. Choose the second. If today you said, wow, I don't know what this whole prayer thing is about. I don't know what God can do in my life, but I want to accept Jesus as my Lord and Savior, choose that. And on the bottom, there's a little interest we want to take, because there's a little straw poll we want to take, because next year, we're interested in bringing in a speaker. If you're going through a wilderness experience, maybe in your marriage, and you're interested in joining, in attending a marriage enrichment weekend that we have planned, we don't have a date for this yet, but we know sometime around February 2020. If this is something you're interested or would be interested in attending, please mark that box. Because we're trying to get data here to find out if that is that last one, especially if we should go and basically go forward with that. So if you are interested, and if you see that there's enough if we see that there's enough of an interest, we will book that. But no matter where you are, and no matter if you respond to this altar call or not, trust that if you're not in a wilderness yet, you're probably going to find yourself in one eventually. And how you respond in those circumstances will make all the difference, not just for you, but for those around you. God bless you this morning.